Oh, hi. Sorry, I was just looking at all the stuff we wrote on the board for this lesson. So today we're going to look at defeating your opponent's examples. And as you can see, there's a lot of stuff written here. There's a lot we're going to cover, but don't feel overwhelmed. I'm going to post notes on this on the class website after this video, so you can look at it on paper as well. But we are going to go look at picking at your opponent's examples. And there are a lot of ways to defeat your opponent's examples. And this is really effective because many times your opponent's whole contention, the whole contention is supported by one example. So if you can defeat the example, you effectively have defeated the contention. So really this is similar to the last video about defeating the contentions. So let's look at the first way you can defeat your opponent's examples. And first way is, and you can follow along with these thought bubbles that you're thinking about how you're going to defeat your opponent. The first way, you can show that his examples do not support his point or they don't support his side. So ask, is that example really an example of his or her side? So with the fair trade versus free trade resolution, if your opponent used an example to show why fair trade is good or bad, ask, is that really an example of fair trade, or was that actually something else, or was that free trade? If your opponent used an example to show why free trade is good or bad, ask, is that really an example of free trade? You can ask things like that. As an example, say your opponent, I just gave you an example. Your opponent says, this policy is an example of free trade, and this shows how free trade leads to prosperity. This example of free trade, look at how it's leading to prosperity. And you can say, wait a minute, that wasn't free trade leading to prosperity. That was actually fair trade. That was not free trade. You're wrong. So actually, that shows how fair trade led to prosperity, which actually means I should win that argument. So you can flip it around or something like that. Just show that his examples don't support his point or side. Maybe even they support yours instead if you're really lucky. Another thing you can ask, did this example really, if it's an example related to the values and not so much as the sides, because the last one was more for examples relating to the sides. If there's an example relating to the values, you can ask, did this example really lead to or harm their value like the opponent said it did? Did that example really uphold that value or really harm that value? Did that example really harm my value? So pretend the affirmative uses the example, the Paris Climate Accord, which is this treaty that was created under the Obama era. The Paris Climate Accord, it harmed human rights. It's a bad example. It harmed the value of human rights. My value is human rights. The Paris Climate Accord harmed human rights. And then maybe the neg responds, actually, did it really harm human rights? Did it really harm that value? The Paris Climate Accord harms prosperity, but prosperity is not a human right. It didn't actually harm human rights, it harmed prosperity. So this is not actually an example of what you're saying it is. It doesn't apply. Or it can work the other way. You can ask, did that example harm my value? If the opponent's given an example of how your value is bad, you can do the same thing. Did that example really harm my value? That wasn't actually an example of my value being bad. That was an example of something else. My value is fine. So just ask, is that really what you're saying it is? That's basically what it boils down to. Another thing you can show is that information is missing in the example or story, and it's not the whole story. The opponent is leaving something out, leaving out something crucially important. They're ignoring that to make their example look good, but it's not the whole story, and it's taken out of context. So if it was meant as a positive example of something good, you can ask, were there any negative consequences to this positive example that the opponent didn't mention? If it was meant as a negative example of how something's harmful, were there any positive consequences that the opponent didn't mention? So, for example, say that the negative of whatever resolution it is, he uses the example of Singapore. He says, Singapore punishes their criminals very harshly, and because of that, everyone's afraid of the punishment. Nobody commits crimes. Singapore is an example of how harsh punishment is good because it lowers crime. And the AF responds, well, that's great, but you didn't tell the whole story. You didn't tell the whole story. You actually left out a very negative part of this positive example. Singapore does punish people very strictly, but they're too strict, and sometimes they even beat people for spitting gum on the street. Believe it or not, this has happened. That's way overkill. You left out that part. This example is not a good thing. No one would want to live in a society like that. Singapore's being too harsh. This is actually a bad thing. This is not something we should praise. We shouldn't praise Singapore's criminal justice system. So you can flip it around that way. That's not the whole story. You can see if there's actually something, if they're leaving out something. So basically it comes down to the two important things. Does the example actually support the opponent's side? If the opponent has an example and he says, this is an example of how fair trade is good or free trade is good, my side, does the example actually support his side? And with his value, and if he gives an example of saying, oh, look at this, in this example, my value was awesome, does that example actually support his value? Does it really support his value? Or does it actually prove something else totally unrelated? All right, another thing over here, is it actually good or bad? So if he gives some sort of example of something good happening, like, oh, this thing was good, and this relates to Singapore, I guess. This thing was good. Is it actually good or is it bad? In the case of Singapore, it was actually bad. If he gives an example of a good example, was that actually bad? If he gives an example of a bad example, was that actually good? And it's not really what he's saying it is. I once ran into a debater who was arguing this one example and saying, this was not good. It's not good that we should have, it's not good that we did this. And actually, it was good that we did that thing. Anyway, I already explained it. Is it actually good or bad? Just ask if they're bringing up a good example, is that actually a good example or is that actually a bad example? Is that actually bad what they did there? All right, another thing you can show that the examples are irrelevant. Maybe they don't have anything to do with anything. They're irrelevant, they don't prove anything, throw them out the window. Another thing, you could say the example is ineffective, and this especially applies to policy. And with the fair trade versus free trade resolution, if you happen to be debating that, that's actually all about policy. LD isn't supposed to be about policy, but sometimes we end up debating policies because of the resolutions that are chosen. So, especially with policies, the affirmative maybe will bring up an example saying, this policy of fair trade was very effective, it created prosperity, it helped the economy. This example, this policy of fair trade in this situation was good. One thing you could ask is, was that policy actually effective? Did it actually do what it said it would do? If this fair trade policy was implemented to promote prosperity, did that actually happen? Maybe not. Maybe it was supposed to increase prosperity. Maybe that policy actually decreased prosperity or didn't do anything. It was ineffective. You can slap them with this. That you can say, well, yes, they had good intentions, but it didn't work. Your side doesn't work. Don't vote for you. You can say, don't say it like that, but say something along those lines. Another thing, wrong. I've seen this a lot. Many times, your opponent will bring up an example and say something, and he can be totally wrong about it. For example, he can say, this policy did this and that, and it resulted in this. When he doesn't have his facts straight. Maybe he misunderstood the evidence he was reading. Maybe he deliberately twisted the example, but he's just wrong. And the example is wrong. And if you do research on the example, you can say, actually, that's wrong. That's my opponent's wrong on that. That is not correct. That example is not correct. That's not what happened. That's not what it was for. Wrong. All right. Extreme examples over here. We talked about this a little bit. If the example is too extreme, you can say, that is an extreme example, and that's an exception. We shouldn't use that. Like if they give an example of North Korea. North Korea is extreme on a lot of things, so you can say that's an extreme example. If they give some kind of example with Hitler and they say, see, patriotism is bad. This is an example of how patriotism is harmful. You say, that's an extreme example. Patriotism is usually good. It's just taken to an extreme, it's bad. See, the problem is taken to an extreme, anything is bad. Say that I go out for breakfast one day and I want to decide if I should eat carbs or meat for breakfast. Okay? Both carbs and meat are good things to have for breakfast, right? Yes. But what if I make it extreme and I say, should I eat 20 pounds of carbs today or should I eat 20 pounds of meat today for breakfast? At that point, when you're taking it to that extremes, at extreme levels, anything becomes harmful. 20 pounds of carbs for breakfast will be very harmful to my health. 20 pounds of meat for breakfast will be very harmful to my health. Anything at extremes is very harmful. So we can't look at extremes because anything becomes bad in extremes. So don't look at extremes. So if your opponent presents an extreme example, you can even give that analogy if you want or something along those lines and say, extremes are bad. Let's not debate extremes. And you can even ask in cross-examination, are we debating extremes? And usually they'll say, no. We'll talk about that more later in the cross-examination section. Anyway, getting back to the issue at hand, how to defeat your examples. One other thing you can do is, where is it? Oh yeah, show that your opponent's examples actually support your side. This is really cool. Your opponent will give an example, say of, oh, I'm on the side of fair trade. This example supports fair trade. It shows how fair trade's good. Twist it around and say, actually, that example shows how my side of free trade is good. That's an example of free trade. So twist your opponents around, make them support your side. Make your opponent's example support your side. That totally flips everything on its head, and all of a sudden your opponent is advocating for you with your own example, and nothing feels better. Okay, another thing, this is very, very important here. This is probably more important than all the other strategies, or maybe not, but it's pretty important. One thing you can do is provide a counter example. What does this mean? It means you present another example. So if your opponent presents an example saying free trade leads to prosperity, your response can be an example of how fair trade leads to prosperity. So you can say, yes, you know what? In that example, it was true in that case. You're right, opponent, but it's not always true. Look at this other example I have. Didn't happen there. And at the least, at that point, you can say, you know what? We don't know which side promotes prosperity because there's conflicting examples, so let's just forget the whole thing. That's called washing it off the flow. You can just say neither side wins because there's one example saying this, there's one example saying the other thing, forget the whole thing. Or sometimes you can say, look at this example, and this is even better. Look at this example. This proves that my side wins, not yours, so I win. I win this argument. So if you have an example, opponent, of how free trade leads to prosperity, I brought an example of how fair trade leads to prosperity, fair trade leads to prosperity, I should win. And that's even better. So always try to do that if you can. Sometimes you can even present multiple counterexamples. So you say, opponent, you might have one example of free trade leading to prosperity. I have 3 examples of fair trade leading to prosperity. It's pretty clear fair trade should win. Fair trade leads to prosperity. I win the argument. So those are some things you can do with counterexamples. So with counterexamples, always try to use the counterexample to show why your side wins, but at the very least, you can at least show how neither side wins. But it's preferable to just show that your side wins. Neither side wins, that's a last resort. That's a last resort scenario, and that's called washing off the flow. That's a little more advanced, so I'm not going to go into it in detail now since this is sort of a beginner's course. And then the last thing, which I already touched on a bit, correlation is not causation. Again, if I eat waffles and it rains, that doesn't mean my eating waffles made it rain. If the opponent presents an example of how one country adopted free trade, and all of a sudden, something else happened in the country, doesn't necessarily mean that the free trade caused that something to happen. It can mean that if the opponent can prove that the end result was a result of the free trade, that the consequence was a result of the free trade, then yes. But just because 2 things happen doesn't necessarily mean they're related. They can be related, they might be related, but it doesn't mean that they're related. So you can also look out for this if the opponent uses something, because your opponent might use something with correlation is not causation, where he says this thing happened and this thing happened, therefore this happened because of that. And you can say, no, correlation is not causation. This example does not prove anything. And that's it. I know this is a very long video. We've looked at a lot of different ways you can defeat your example. So why don't you take a break? I'll put the lecture notes or a handout or something up on the website so you can review these. These are all very important. All of these are strategies I have used in debate rounds over the past few years that I've been debating. So hopefully they will come in handy at some point. And the next video will be much shorter and less important. We're going to look at how to pick at your opponent's use of quotes. And sometimes you don't even need to bother to do that unless the quote is really central. But anyway, I will cover that. So I'll see you in the next video.